The morning light hit Marcus Reed's face like a judgment. He'd been awake since 4, the way he always was on his ranch, watching the horizon shift from indigo to amber across the Nevada high desert. 43 years old, weathered hands that could coax life from impossible soil, and a heart that had learned to trust land more than people. His property, 200 acres of carefully maintained pasture, a restored farmhouse, 2 barns, and 15 head of Holsteins that he treated like family, represented everything he'd built since his divorce 3 years ago. The text came through at 6:47 a.m. "Hey babe, so excited, see you at noon." Marcus stared at the message from his ex-wife, Diane, for a long moment. He scrolled back through their thread. Nothing, no context, no explanation. He called her. "Diane, what's happening at noon?" Her voice came through bright and rushed, the way it always did when she wanted something. "Oh, I forgot to tell you. I'm hosting a fundraiser event for the Women's Wellness Coalition. It's going to be amazing. 100 of the most important people in the valley right there on your property. It's perfect. Those rolling hills, the sunset views, the rustic charm everyone's obsessed with. I've already got a catering company booked, a florist coming in at 8 and—" "Stop," Marcus said quietly. "What are you talking about?" "Your ranch, Marcus. I'm using your ranch. We discussed this." "We absolutely did not discuss this." "Marcus, don't be difficult. I'm still technically part owner until the settlement's finalized, and honestly this is better for both of us. You get exposure, I get the perfect venue. The event's happening whether you cooperate or not." She hung up before he could respond. Marcus stood there, phone still pressed to his ear, feeling the peculiar sensation of the ground shifting beneath him. Not literally, but in that deeper way that matters more. He had 3 hours. He tried calling back twice. Voicemail, texts went unanswered. He considered just leaving, driving into town, but something kept him there. A stubborn refusal to abandon his home. So he waited, and at 11:52 a.m. the first vehicles began rolling up the private drive. They came like an invasion, dressed in designer labels. 3 trucks arrived first, laden with rental tables, chairs, and a bar setup that looked more appropriate for a Vegas club than a working ranch. Then came the florist's van, followed by a catering truck that said Artemisia's in elegant script. And finally, in a pristine white Range Rover with temporary plates, came Diane, and trailing behind her a woman Marcus had never met before. This woman was the problem. She was in her late 40s, with professionally sculpted blonde hair, porcelain skin, and the kind of aggressive beauty that comes from never accepting no as an answer. She wore white, head to toe white, and moved across the landscape like she was personally redecorating it as she walked. She was already on her phone, already gesturing emphatically at his cows, already making decisions. "Who is that?" Marcus asked as Diane approached. "Oh, this is Corinne. She's the foundation president. She's been absolutely crucial in organizing this. Honestly, Marcus, you should be thanking her. This is going to put your ranch on the map." Marcus didn't say anything. He watched Corinne circle his property, her hand over her mouth in what he recognized as performative shock, the expression of someone seeing an opportunity rather than viewing an actual space. "We'll need to fence off that section with the animals," Corinne announced, gesturing broadly at the pasture where his cows grazed. "I don't want any issues. We're expecting very high net worth donors. Someone from the tech sector is flying in, and I believe we're getting the mayor's wife. This needs to be sophisticated, refined." "Those are my cows," Marcus said. Corinne turned to him as if noticing him for the first time. Her smile was polite, the kind you give to people whose job it is to be helpful. "Yes, well, they're charming, but they're rather unpredictable. I'm sure they'll be fine wherever they are. Just keep them away from the main event." Marcus felt something crystallize in his chest. A moment of absolute clarity in which he understood that this woman had never been told no about anything in her life. And he understood that telling her no now would do absolutely nothing. "Ms. Reed, is it?" Corinne continued, not waiting for confirmation. "I'll need you to understand that this event is incredibly important. The foundation has never hosted something this exclusive in a rural setting before. Everyone's taking a risk coming out here. We're going to be very careful about the details." "It's Mr. Reed," Marcus said, "and you should leave." Corinne's laugh was like wind chimes in a hurricane, delicate but somehow aggressive in its cheerfulness. "Oh, you're funny. Diane said you had a sense of humor." "I'm not joking." Diane stepped forward, her face already cycling through the expressions Marcus knew well. Negotiation, appeasement, the fake smile he'd seen 1,000 times. "Marcus, please, just for one evening. We'll have everything cleaned up by morning." The florist was already running extension cords to the farmhouse. The catering team was setting up warming stations. 2 men were positioning a massive white tent. He hadn't even heard them discussing a tent in what was technically the prime grazing area. Another team was unloading champagne bottles, stacking them in pyramid formations that were obviously going to be disaster waiting for impact. Marcus walked back toward the barn. Behind him, Karen's voice rose. Someone should probably check on whether he's going to be a problem. He locked himself in the tack room and sat on the hay bales where he used to sit and cry during the worst days of his divorce. At some point, Diane knocked and said they'd handle the livestock situation, and she left without waiting for response. The afternoon filled with the sounds of an elaborate party being constructed in his home, and Marcus did what he'd learned to do when the world became unmanageable. He focused on the things he could control. He fed his cows. He moved them to the eastern pasture, the one furthest from the main event area. He checked each animal, running his hands along their flanks, murmuring to them. These 15 Holsteins were the clearest relationship in his life. No games with them, no pretense, just honest animals, honest work, honest rest. By the time evening arrived, the property had transformed. Thousands of white lights hung between posts he didn't remember anyone installing. The flower arrangements were genuinely stunning. He had to admit that, masses of white roses and hydrangeas and things he couldn't name, arranged with absolute precision. A string quartet was setting up on the patio. The champagne pyramids glowed under strategic lighting. And it was all happening on his land. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Hi, Marcus. I'm Sarah, one of the coordinators. Karen wants to know if you have any dietary restrictions or if you'll be joining us for photos." He didn't respond. At 6:47 p.m., the guests began arriving. Mercedes sedans, Tesla roadsters, women in gowns that probably cost more than his monthly mortgage, men in suits that fit like they'd been born into them. They moved across his ranch like they were colonizing a new territory, laughing at the rustic charm, comparing the sunset to Cabo, making Instagram-ready poses in front of his barns. Karen emerged from the farmhouse wearing a white gown that must have required industrial engineering to keep upright. She'd styled her hair into something resembling a sculpture. She looked like a bride at a wedding where she was simultaneously guest and centerpiece. Marcus watched from the shadows of the northern barn, knowing he should leave, unable to make himself do it. And that's when he saw Karen notice the cows. They weren't supposed to be visible. The eastern pasture was behind the property, out of sight from the main event. But Bessie, his oldest Holstein, the one who'd birthed 8 healthy calves in 10 years, had apparently decided to wander over the ridge. She stood backlit by the sunset, silhouetted against the orange and purple sky, genuinely majestic in that accidental way animals sometimes are. Karen's face went through a transformation. Shock, then anger, then calculation. He watched her march over to one of the catering staff. "Move the cows," he heard her say. "I don't care how, move them." The catering staff member, a young kid, maybe 22, looked bewildered. "Ma'am, they're livestock. I'm a bartender." "Then get someone who's not a bartender. This is supposed to be an elegant event." And that's when everything went sideways. The catering kid approached Marcus with a nervous smile, clearly hopping for rescue. "Hey, man, is there any way you could move your cows? The lady in white is being pretty intense about it." Marcus considered his options. He could refuse. He could tell the kid that this was his property and nobody got to make demands about his animals. He could let this whole thing collapse right here. Instead, he walked to the eastern pasture with the kid, opened the gate, and began moving the cows back toward the northern barn. He moved them slowly, calmly, the way you move livestock when you want to keep them safe. Each animal followed the lead of the others, moving as a herd, trusting him the way they always did. What Marcus didn't know was that 3 of his 15 cows were in heat. What he didn't account for was that the veterinary clinic had called earlier in the week about one of them, Daisy, being particularly agitated due to a cycle. He'd been planning to monitor her, but the week had been a blur of work and now this chaos, and he'd just shifted 3 hormonally volatile animals into proximity with the biggest social disruption their pasture had seen in years. What he absolutely could not have predicted was that while he was moving the cows, Karen had decided that the eastern pasture, the one with the cows, actually had the best views of the sunset, and she was directing the photography team to set up there for the golden hour portraits. So when Karen herself led a group of the evening's most important guests into that pasture for what she called an intimate moment with authentic rural life, the three cows in heat took it as an affront. Bessie charged first, not viciously, but with absolute determination. She was a 1,000-pound animal in a state of biological urgency, and she was moving toward the paddock gate where the other cows were, toward the male she'd been separated from. Karen was standing directly in that path. Marcus saw it happen with the clarity that comes in moments of disaster. He was 50 yards away, near the western fence line, and he ran. But the distance was impossible. The momentum was inevitable. Bessie's shoulder caught Karen directly in the chest. It wasn't a goring. It wasn't a vicious attack. It was a cow, following her basic instincts, moving through a space where an elaborate woman in white happened to be standing. But the impact was significant. Karen flew backward 6 feet, landed on her perfectly sculpted rear end in the mud, and screamed in a way that shattered the peaceful evening and sent every guest running in various directions. For a moment, there was absolute silence. Then chaos. "Call 911, someone yelled. "Is she dead?" someone else asked. "The cow is still moving," a third voice, higher-pitched, more hysterical. Marcus reached Karen first. She was gasping, the wind knocked out of her, but conscious, furious. Her white gown was streaked with mud. One of her false eyelashes was hanging at an angle. Her hair sculpture was definitely compromised. "I'm fine," she wheezed. I'm fine, just need a moment." But her eyes were blazing with a rage that Marcus recognized. This was a woman who was accustomed to a specific narrative, and her narrative did not include being knocked into the dirt by livestock on her own event. Diane was there helping Karen up, apologizing profusely to the shocked guests. The string quartet had stopped playing. The photographer was still shooting. Of course she was. This was better content than anything Karen had planned. Guests were pulling out their phones, already recording, already thinking about how to frame the story. Karen looked directly at Marcus, and he saw the moment she decided. The moment she turned a genuine accident into a violation. The moment she chose her role in this story. "You did this on purpose," she said quietly. Her voice had changed. It was soft now, controlled, dangerous. "You sabotaged your own event because you were jealous of me." "That's not what. Get those animals away from here, right now. And you need to understand that you have just created a serious liability issue. I have 50 witnesses who saw this. My attorney will be in touch." She turned away from him, straightening her destroyed dress, gathering the tattered pieces of her dignity around her like a cape. Diane looked torn between comforting her ex-husband and supporting her alliance. She chose alliance. Of course she did. The party continued, but it had fundamentally changed. Now it was a story worth telling, the glamorous event that went wrong. The wealthy woman attacked by livestock, the negligent rancher who couldn't control his animals. Phones stayed out. The photographer who'd captured everything became the most important person in the room. Marcus moved the cows to the very furthest pasture. Bessie was calm now, her moment of urgency past, completely unaware of the consequences of her biological imperative. He stood with her, running his hand along her neck, feeling the warmth of her breathing. The party raged on into the night. By midnight, Marcus had received 7 text messages from unknown numbers, friends of Diane's, apparently, all offering variations of the same message. "You should not have let this happen. Karen is talking about pressing charges. You need to apologize." One from Diane at 1:34 a.m. "Please call me. This is serious." He didn't call. At 2:47 a.m., when the last Range Rover finally rolled down his driveway, Marcus sat on his porch with a beer that had gone warm, watching the white lights still gleaming in the darkness. The catering crew had largely cleaned up, though there were still details. A champagne flute overturned in the flower beds, a shoe, one of a pair, dangling from a garden stake, a monogrammed napkin caught on the fence. That's when the real problem began. Diane called at 3:15 a.m., her voice panicked, her words running together. "Marcus, oh my God, Marcus, you need to check your email right now. Karen's sending everything to her attorney." She's saying that you had negligent security, that the animals posed a clear and present danger, that you recklessly allowed a dangerous situation. She's talking about a lawsuit. She's talking about the city coming out and quarantining the animals. She's saying you violated her rights as someone invited to the property. Diane, stop. She's very angry, Marcus. Then maybe she shouldn't have come here without permission. There was a long silence. I gave her permission, Diane said quietly. As a property co-owner, I gave her permission, and I'm going to give a statement saying I did. You're going to need an attorney. She hung up. Marcus opened his email. The message from Corinne's attorney was 37 pages long. It outlined a litany of negligence: failure to properly secure livestock, failure to warn of dangers, failure to maintain adequate barriers between private animals and invited guests, failure to provide reasonable accommodations for a protected event, reckless endangerment. The final paragraph suggested that if Marcus was willing to settle $250,000 plus a public apology, plus payment for the destroyed dress and required medical evaluation, plus a written statement acknowledging his wrongdoing, they would consider the matter resolved. Sharon Chen, Esquire, was 62 years old and had been practicing property and personal injury law in Nevada for longer than Marcus had been alive. She was also, conveniently, from the Valley. She'd gone to high school with Marcus's father. She knew land the way most people know their own skin. She read the cease and desist letter in the waiting room while Marcus sat in an uncomfortable chair, drinking terrible office coffee. "This is theater," Sharon said finally, folding the papers back into their envelope. "This is a woman who is used to being believed accusing you of something in the most elaborate way possible, hoping you'll panic and pay her to go away." 50 people saw what happened, Marcus said. Right, and what they saw was a cow being a cow while an uninvited woman trespassed on private property during an event she imposed on your ranch without your consent. You have documentation that you didn't authorize this event. You have your ex-wife's own text confirming she didn't ask permission. You have the legal standing to refuse access to your own property at any time. But she was invited. Diane invited her. Diane is a property co-owner who made a unilateral decision about use of the property without consulting the other owner. That's a separate issue, one we'll need to address in your divorce settlement, but it doesn't make you liable for what happens to her guests. Sharon leaned back in her chair. It creaked with the sound of 1,000 confidential conversations. "Here's what I think happened. Corinne had an accident. She's embarrassed, and she's used to solving embarrassment with money. She's betting that you don't have the stomach for a fight." "I don't," Marcus admitted. "Good thing you called me then." Sharon sent a response letter that was 12 pages long and considerably less theatrical. It outlined the facts: Marcus's non-consent, Diane's unilateral decision, the accident's clearly accidental nature, the excessive and unreasonable nature of the settlement demand. The letter concluded by stating that any further communication regarding this matter should come through Sharon directly, and that any attempt at public defamation of Marcus Reed would be met with immediate litigation for tortious interference and slander. It was a well-constructed threat, wrapped in legal language. For 3 days nothing happened, then the story leaked. It appeared first on a Las Vegas gossip blog. Local Wellness Foundation president attacked by livestock at exclusive ranch event. The article, sourced to people with knowledge of the situation, painted a vivid picture. A glamorous event for important community members, a reckless rancher who'd failed to secure dangerous animals, a brave woman who'd faced medical trauma and now was fighting for accountability. From there, the narrative began its migration. By the next morning, the story was in the local news, then the regional news, then picked up by entertainment blogs and social media influencers. Corinne, being Corinne, decided to amplify it. She did an interview with a local news station, sitting in what appeared to be a therapist's office, or at least a room designed to look like one, discussing the trauma of the event. "I was just trying to help the community," she said, her voice carefully modulated to sound brave and fragile. "I thought opening myself to a more authentic rural experience would be meaningful. I didn't expect to be endangered by someone's negligence." The interviewer asked 3 times if she was considering legal action. 3 times, Corinne gave a different answer, first saying she was focused on healing, then saying her attorney was exploring options, finally saying that she really just wanted Marcus to understand the harm he'd caused. Sharon called Marcus after the interview aired. "This is actually good for us," she said. "She's admitting she knew about the animals. She's saying she put herself into a situation. Let her keep talking. Every interview tightens the rope she's hanging herself with." But Marcus wasn't thinking about legal strategy. He was thinking about the fact that 3 locals had already called to cancel orders. He ran a small side business selling grass-fed beef, and that 2 families had withdrawn their kids from the community writing lessons he taught every Saturday. He was thinking about the fact that his name was now attached to the phrase "dangerous livestock" on the internet, indexed by Google, immortalized. Local Facebook groups discussed his negligence. A Change.org petition was created. "Hold negligent ranchers accountable." Someone started a hashtag, #ranchaccountability, and it trended regionally. A lawyer from Los Angeles, never a good sign, appeared on a morning show talking about emerging liability issues with rural properties hosting events. 3 more cancellations came from families who wanted to keep their kids away from the dangerous ranch. Diane called, ostensibly to warn him that Karen was getting organized, but really to make clear that Diane's attorney was advising her to distance herself completely from both the incident and Marcus. The settlement negotiations on the property were going to have to happen through lawyers, she said. She couldn't be associated with him right now. "I know you didn't mean for any of this to happen," Diane added, and somehow that was worse than anything else. The sympathy from someone who was actively abandoning you. Marcus wasn't sleeping. He was spending hours online watching people who'd never met him, who'd never set foot on his property, argue about whether he was a reckless endangerer or simply negligent. There was a video trending, edited footage of him moving the cows with dramatic music and text overlays. Did he warn the guests? No. Did he secure the animals? No. Did he take responsibility? No. He recognized the video because it had been filmed from his own property, from that photographer who'd been so busy documenting the event. Of course, she had gotten shots of the cows, too. Content was content. Sharon kept assuring him that the lawsuit would be thrown out, that Karen's case was frivolous, that the evidence was on his side. But lawsuits, Sharon explained, cost money whether you win or lose. The legal fees were already climbing toward $50,000, and they were only in the early stages. Marcus had savings, not enough, not nearly enough. He went to the bank and looked at his accounts. $137,000, representing 15 years of work, discipline, and careful planning. Minus legal fees, minus the loss of income, minus the impact this was having on his business. The math was terrifying. He was sitting in his truck, parked at the edge of his property, watching his cows graze in the distance when his phone rang. Unknown number. "Mr. Reed, this is Detective Marcus Webb from the Clark County Sheriff's Department. I'm calling regarding an incident on your property approximately 1 week ago. We've received a formal complaint related to animal endangerment. We're going to need to inspect your property and your livestock. Are you available this afternoon?" Marcus pulled a grass blade and put it in his mouth, the way his father had taught him, the way people did when they were thinking. "Yeah," he said finally. "I'm available." The inspection took 2 hours. Detective Webb was professional, thorough, and ultimately dismissive. The cows were healthy, properly fed, properly housed. The fencing was adequate. The incident had occurred in an open pasture during an event Marcus hadn't authorized. There was no evidence of negligence or endangerment from an animal care perspective. "However," Detective Webb said as he was leaving, "I'm recommending that if you host events on this property in the future, you implement additional security measures. Not because there's anything inherently dangerous here, but because this situation has drawn public attention. You need to be able to demonstrate that you're taking reasonable precautions." "I didn't want the event," Marcus said. "I understand that, but the public doesn't know that, and public perception has consequences." After the detective left, Marcus sat on his porch as the sun moved toward evening. His cows were silhouettes against the orange sky, indifferent to all of this. They didn't care about narratives or social media or Karen's feelings, or the fact that Marcus was being slowly dismantled by a story that wasn't true. That's when his phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "Hi Marcus, I'm Riley Chen, Sharon's daughter. I'm a documentary filmmaker and I'm interested in covering your story from the actual facts perspective. Would you be willing to talk?" Marcus almost deleted it, but something made him call the number. Riley turned out to be 31, with dark eyes that suggested she didn't miss details, and a way of speaking that made it clear she'd done her research. She came to his property with a camera person and spent 4 hours documenting the layout, the pastures, the cows, his daily routine. She asked detailed questions about the actual events of that evening. "My mother thinks Karen's case is frivolous," Riley said, "but I'm interested in why it's resonating, why people are believing it, why you've become the villain in a story that clearly isn't what people think it is." "You should talk to the photographer who filmed it," Marcus suggested. "She got everything." The photographer who posted the edited version on Instagram already did. Turns out Karen called her the day after the event and asked for the footage. Paid her $300 to edit it a specific way. The unedited version is much different. Marcus felt something unclasp in his chest. It was small, insignificant in the grand scheme of things, but it was something. Riley's documentary, called Narrative, dropped 3 weeks later on a mid-tier streaming platform. It was 92 minutes long, and it did something that the news cycle hadn't. It asked basic questions. It showed the unedited footage. It showed Karen making the original decision to use Marcus's ranch. It showed the veterinary record about Daisy's cycle. It showed Marcus's legal documentation of non-consent. It showed the edited version side by side with the actual footage, demonstrating the manipulation. And it interviewed people: the photographer, the catering staff member, the veterinarian, Sharon, and Marcus himself, who finally got to tell his actual story instead of defending against allegations. The documentary premiered at a film festival in San Francisco. It won the Audience Award for Documentary Short Form. More importantly, it went viral, not on Instagram, but on the kind of platforms where people actually engaged with nuance. The irony, Marcus learned, was that the narrative doesn't end when the truth comes out. It just gets more complex. Some people doubled down on Karen's story, claiming the documentary was biased or that Marcus had manipulated the footage, which he hadn't. Others pivoted to a different narrative. Karen had simply had a misunderstanding or was acting with good intentions. A handful of people actually engaged with the truth and adjusted their opinions accordingly. But the broader arc shifted. Articles that had condemned Marcus shifted to more nuanced takes. Local rancher caught in narrative trap, or when public perception becomes weaponized. Karen, for her part, quietly resigned from the foundation. She eventually released a statement saying she'd been processing her emotions and that she and Marcus had reached a mutual understanding. They hadn't. Marcus had learned that reaching understanding with someone who doesn't believe she's done anything wrong is impossible. The legal fees ended up being $87,000 by the time everything was settled. His insurance covered some of it, but not all. His beef sales came back slowly, then strongly. The writing lessons resumed. By summer, it was almost possible to believe that life was returning to normal. Diane's attorney called in August to finalize the settlement. The ranch would be fully Marcus's now. She'd take cash instead of continued property. When Marcus signed the final papers, he felt a weight lift that he didn't even know was sitting on him. This was his, not negotiable, not subject to someone else's agenda. He scheduled a small, quiet ceremony, just himself and Sharon and Riley and a few close friends, where he officially claimed full ownership of the ranch. He planted a tree. He didn't make speeches, but he did stand in the evening light and acknowledge that he'd survived something. The cows, of course, had no idea any of this had happened. They continued their simple existence, eating, breeding, producing milk, living the unexamined lives of animals. Bessie, the one who'd started everything, gave birth to a healthy calf that September. Marcus named her Justice, which he acknowledged was heavy-handed but also honest. He couldn't help himself. What Marcus hadn't expected was what happened next. Approximately 4 months after the documentary dropped, Karen got arrested. It was for tax evasion, not related to Marcus's incident. Apparently, the foundation she'd been running was being investigated for financial irregularities. The investigation had uncovered that Karen had been misrepresenting donation amounts and taking administrative fees that bordered on embezzlement. The full scope of the scheme was still being determined, but the preliminary numbers suggested she'd stolen approximately $400,000 over 3 years. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Marcus learned about it from a news alert. He read the article twice, then called Sharon. "Is this real?" he asked. Very real and very, very helpful for you. It establishes a pattern of behavior. Karen is someone who manipulates narratives and exploits people for personal gain. Your case becomes contextual. You're not just someone who had a bad incident. You're someone Karen attempted to exploit. I don't want to exploit her back, Marcus said. You're establishing context. There's a difference. But Marcus understood something deeper. Karen would likely be convicted. She would face actual consequences, prison time, restitution, the kind of real accountability that didn't exist in the world of social media narratives. And somehow, that seemed like the least important part of what had happened. What mattered was that the truth eventually had surfaced. Not because the system worked perfectly, but because one person, Riley, had decided to look deeper. Because Sharon had believed in proper evidence. Because the cows, in their simple animal way, had forced a moment of honesty into a situation that had been all illusion. Not the reputation Karen had tried to give it, but the opposite. People started visiting because they'd seen the documentary. They wanted photos with the cows. They wanted to hear the story. Riley had turned the incident into an educational platform about narrative manipulation, and the ranch had become, despite Marcus's better judgment, a minor destination for people interested in media literacy. He hired 2 full-time staff members to help manage the visiting tour. He kept the academic visits limited. He wouldn't let his animals become circus attractions. But he allowed journalists and educators and filmmakers to document the property and understand what had actually happened. The settlement with Karen's legal team, which was really just buying her silence at that point, had included a clause where she couldn't profit from her story, discuss the incident publicly, or attempt to contact Marcus. She was serving 18 months in a minimum security facility upstate, and Marcus tried not to think about her anymore. He succeeded about 60% of the time. Diane had married a venture capitalist and moved to San Francisco. They were nice to each other now, in the way ex-spouses can be when there's no more property or money at stake. She'd attended the dedication ceremony when Marcus officially opened part of his property to educational tour, and they'd been cordial. Not friends, but not enemies either. The documentary had made Riley somewhat famous, at least in independent film circles. She was working on a second film, this one about narrative formation in the digital age, and she'd asked Marcus to be one of the central case studies. He'd agreed, though he sometimes wondered if he was just replaying the event for consumption instead of actually moving past it. Sharon had retired, referring her remaining cases to younger lawyers she'd mentored. She visited the ranch every other month and always brought wine and the kind of bread you couldn't find in supermarkets. They'd become genuine friends, which Marcus understood was a gift born from crisis. The cows were happy. That was the most important thing, really. They grazed, they reproduced, they provided milk. They lived the kind of uncomplicated existence that made Marcus envious sometimes. Justice, Bessie's calf, was now a healthy young Holstein, and Marcus had decided to keep her bloodline in the herd. There was something meaningful about keeping the story alive in that way, not through narratives or documentaries, but through simple biological continuation. On the 1-year anniversary of the event, Marcus stood alone in the western pasture at sunset. He'd deliberately not told anyone about this moment. He didn't want it to be documented or witnessed. He just wanted to be here in the place where the chaos had occurred and acknowledge that he'd survived it. The sky was burning, orange and red and gold, the kind of sunset that made you understand why people believed in religion. His cows moved lazily in the distance, completely indifferent to the majesty of the moment. He appreciated that about them. They never overstated things. They never turned a simple evening into a story that was more important than the evening itself. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Is this Marcus Reed? I'm a producer at a major network, and we'd like to develop your story into a limited series. Would you be interested in discussing? Marcus looked at the message for a long moment. Then he blocked the number. He would tell the story when he chose to, and only to people he trusted. He would work with Riley on the educational aspects of narrative formation. He would answer questions from journalists and students and curious people. But he would not sell the story. He would not turn his trauma into entertainment for profit. He would not let Karen's actions determine his future any more than they already had. He had a ranch to run. He had animals that depended on him. He had a life that was quieter and smaller and infinitely more valuable than any narrative could capture. The sun dipped below the horizon and the valley went cool. Marcus walked back toward the farmhouse, his hands in his pockets, his mind already thinking about the next day's work. There were animals to feed, pastures to check, a world that didn't care about stories but only about whether the work got done. He was exactly where he needed to be. And the cows, having stolen the spotlight, or at least Bessie had that one time, went back to simply being cows, unglamorous, unremarkable, perfect in their utter indifference to the human dramas that swirled around them. Which Marcus understood was the whole point. 2 years later, Marcus was invited to speak at a media literacy conference. The keynote speaker had fallen ill, and Riley, who was on the panel, had recommended him. He almost said no, but something made him accept. Standing on a stage in front of 400 educators and media professionals, Marcus didn't talk about Karen. He didn't even tell the story in the way people had come to know it. Instead, he talked about the gap between what happened and what people believed happened. I learned something that year, he told them. I learned that truth and narrative are not the same thing. I learned that good people can genuinely believe a false story if it's told persuasively enough. And I learned that the only antidote to a bad narrative is not a better narrative, it's facts. Evidence, documentation, patience, most of all patience, because the truth moves slower than the lie, but it also moves more certainly. He talked about social media's role in amplifying stories without fact-checking them. He talked about the responsibility of people who have platforms, the photographer, the news outlets, the influencers who'd shared the incident. But mostly, he talked about resilience. The thing about being the villain in someone else's story, he said, is that you can't control the narrative. You can only control whether you believe it about yourself, and whether you take it as a definition of who you are or a thing that happened to you. For a while, I believed it. That was the hardest part, not the legal battles or the financial strain, but the moment where I wondered if maybe I really was negligent, if I really had caused harm, if I really did deserve blame. Once I stopped believing the story, everything got easier. He got a standing ovation, which made him deeply uncomfortable. He also got 17 interview requests afterward, which he declined. What he did do was help Riley establish a nonprofit focused on media literacy education in rural communities. The idea was to teach people in areas without access to journalism education how narratives were constructed, why they mattered, and how to interrogate the stories they were being told. The nonprofit's first major project was documenting the original incident. With Karen's grudging cooperation, she was out of prison by then, did community service, had somehow managed to remain insufferable, to create an educational module about narrative manipulation. It was strange working with Karen on that project, but Marcus discovered something unexpected. Understanding her motivations didn't mean forgiving her, but it did mean he could stop being angry. Karen wasn't evil. She was just a person with specific needs for admiration, for control, for narrative superiority, and she'd chosen to meet those needs in ways that hurt other people. Understanding that she was human rather than a villain somehow made the whole thing less poisonous. 5 years after the party, Marcus's ranch was thriving. He had a full-time educational coordinator, Riley, on the board of his nonprofit, and a reputation as someone who understood narratives and their consequences. The cows continued to be cows. Justice had given birth to a daughter, Marcus, named Hope, which he acknowledged was heavy-handed but also honest. He never married again. He dated occasionally, but he'd learned something about himself that year. He valued his autonomy more than he wanted companionship. That was okay. He'd built a good life with clear boundaries and honest relationships. The animals didn't lie to him. His friends, Sharon, Riley, the staff members he'd hired, had all proven themselves through crisis. And sometimes, on evenings when the light was particular and the sky was turning colors that suggested larger truths, Marcus would stand in his western pasture and think about that party. He would think about Karen's white dress and her aggressive optimism. He would think about Bessie, charging through the chaos towards something she needed. He would think about the moment when everything had changed, when a cow had refused to accept the narrative someone else was trying to impose on her body's behavior. And he would smile, because in the end the cows had stolen the spotlight. But more importantly, they'd taught him something about honesty. You couldn't convince a cow to be other than it was. You couldn't manipulate its nature with a compelling story. It would always be exactly what it was, an animal following its own imperatives, indifferent to your narratives. That was the real lesson. Not that the truth always wins. It doesn't, not always. But that some things are more valuable than winning a narrative war. Some things, like integrity and clarity and the unconditional presence of a creature who will always be honest about its needs, matter more than being liked.